put your hands together, please, for Vawn Corrigan.
Thank you, and lovely to see you all here tonight. So if anyone knows more than I do, feel free to interject. This is I'm going to attempt to kind of do a quick overview of Irish textiles, skimming across the centuries in a mere hour. And I'm counting on Tom to give me various gestures so that I don't keep you here all night and that we run out of steam altogether. So, I mean, just to start off there with the relevance of textiles in Ireland, up until relatively recently, as in, up until the early 1970s, it's estimated that up to 25% of the population were involved in textiles. And I think that might be an underestimation because we completely discount the cottage industry there. And when we talk about the cottage industry, the idea that there were just a handful of women knitting is absolute nonsense. There were teams of hundreds working for the export market in Aran, and it was a significant source of income to women during times of very high unemployment. And the money mattered. I've met women who say they paid for their weddings with their Aran money. They paid to raise their kids when they broke up with their husbands or whatever. And so the making was a very significant part. As if you look back through Irish history, textiles defined whole cities and whole areas were defined by textiles. As we moved towards the era of free education and the tariffs were dropped on importing textiles, textiles became associated somewhat with poverty, and there was the idea that it was more important to be an architect or an accountant than it was to work in a mill where you might be rather bored working on a machine making shirts all day. And as a result, whole generations of history were lost, and a whole community, for example, in the Liberties where we live, generations were involved in textiles, and their stories are often relegated to just the margins, really. So it's very interesting for us to look at what's become of Irish textiles, how they elevated the country at times of terrible poverty, and what a mainstay, why the government continued to fund and support textile industry, why it was so crucial, and as it fell away, what replaced it and what still remains of it. As we move into a new world, it's very niche, it's very luxury, but it's still got the same elements of sustainability and beautiful craftsmanship that we've had for so long. We're known for textile excellence. In fact, the world knows us more than we do. A lot of the time, the people that appreciate Irish textiles and know what Irish linen is and know what the quality of Irish tweed is, and not the Irish people who generally, like especially of a certain generation, don't even know what goes on in a woolen mill and certainly don't care as long as it's cheap. So there's been a whole shift in our attitudes towards textiles, and I think that it's coming back the other way, that people are starting to respect the heritage and respect the craftsmanship and respect what a big part of what it was and remains to some degree of Irish identity, even though we're in a very different world now. So I'm going to fly ahead and I'm going to move on. So if you think of the primary weave, think about baskets, the basket weave being the most basic weave that you would see. So we had to weave to carry our food. Weaving Weaving comes with a certain amount of advancement in society. Nomadic cultures don't weave. Generally, it takes a certain amount of stability to weave. And we know that in Ireland, these patterns here, for example, on the left, you see the most basic weave, which we call plain, tabby, twill weave. And on the right, you see the herringbone. Both patterns you'll still see today in Irish tweed, for example. And we know that we have very few textile remains because textiles are very fragile, and unless the conditions are acidic, they break down very easily. So what we have is that we have our oldest sample of textile, which I didn't bother including because the picture of it isn't great, is from something called the Armoy hoard, which was found in 1904 in the bog, which preserved it, and it was woven in a herringbone pattern in horsehair. So we know by that there was already a high degree of sophistication in weaving. So that's 800 BC. So we also know from transcriptions of our oral tradition, for example, of the stories of the Tuatha Dé Danann and so on, that colour was very important in ancient Ireland. Rank was denoted by colour. Cloth was currency, as it was in many parts of the world. It was gifted to rulers. And because most people actually wore more or less the same thing, which was a linen undergarment and a large wool tufted cape, the differentiation was done in the colours and the trims. We know that from the transcriptions that the daughters of Cormac Mac Art in Tara were weaving with gold threads into the trims. We hear of purple trims, and we also have evidence in the form of the skull of the Barbary ape, which was found in Navan Fort. It's 2,300 years ago, and that would suggest trade routes with North Africa and the Mediterranean for Tyrolean purple, which was highly valued. And there's mentions of that in the Book of Kells, actually, as well, of the purple cloaks. So we know colour was important. When you see those movies of, medieval times and everyone's going around in brown, it actually is inaccurate because we had some pretty bright colours from natural dyes. So the common ones would be lichen, we've got madder to create that lovely red, we've got woad for blue, and we know that in ancient Ireland these dyes were in common usage, and fixatives such as aluminium salts were known as well. So we have a description from ancient Ireland from the Táin. Am I saying it correctly? Táin, thank you. And it says, some with red light blue, deep blue, green or blay, not quite sure what blay is, or white or yellow, bright and fluttering around them, and there is a young red-freckled lad with a crimson cloak in their midst. So red was a very common colour for Irish cloaks. And here's a quiz for you. When do you think red went out of fashion in Ireland for cloaks? It was with the redcoats, because who wanted to be confused then, right? But prior to that, red was the most common or very popular colour. Okay, so what about knit? I'm only going to touch on knit now because you won't see it again, really. Knit wasn't really widespread in Ireland until the 1700s. And even until much later, our knitting was nothing to write home about. We mostly used it for smaller items such as socks and hats, and we were so good at weaving, and we had our two native textiles of linen and wool. And, we had it was like it was sufficient, and knitting came much later. But what was found in the bogs, which is sometimes called incorrectly Viking knitting, is actually nelle binding, newly binding, I think. And this is a one needled hook knotting technique, which is sometimes confused with knit. So that was what we found in the bog. We did not find knit because knit didn't really exist. So you won't hear me talking about knit again because there isn't much to say for it. Suffice to say that in the early 1700s, we know that the women in Mayo were selling socks to supplement their rent, to pay for their rent. But you won't hear much about knit again until we hit Aran. Now, I was delighted when I came into the room to see that replica over there because looky here, it's exactly like my picture. And this is from sketches from this is from 1521, Dura's Sketches of Old Irish Dress. By that time, most of Europe had moved to the English style, which was trews, the forerunners of trousers, look a bit like jodhpurs, and the women more in dresses. But Ireland, we were mostly still in brat and lena. Lena is linen smocks with long sleeves, described as saffron-coloured. I expect they were probably more likely dyed with lichen, but not certain on that. Could have been both. And then they had this top here, which, as you can see on the gentleman there in the picture, and also over there, Iona. And we persisted with a style of dress which was actually more akin to the Greek style of dress than the English style of dress. And this, as you can see from this, was still going on in the 16th century. It was also kind of gender neutral. The O'Neill army, for example, just to give you a little description from the text, they were described as wholly Gaelic in appearance. Their hair was long, fringes hung over their eyes, and they wore shirts with long sleeve dyed with saffron, short tunics and shaggy cloaks. These shaggy cloaks were called brat, and whether you were a queen or a pauper, you wore a brat. And they were so voluminous, and they were tufted, so they were really super warm and weather resistant that you could sleep in them. And there were lots of accounts of people basically wearing nothing or just rags under their brats because it was such a multi-purpose garment. Around your lena you would have worn a kris, which you would have hung your purse and weapons onto. And this, I would say, is our let's say, longest surviving or perhaps last surviving element of traditional Irish dress is a kris. Does anybody know what's kind of different about this sort of weaving? Hazard a guess, weaving, dyeing lady? No? No loom. You tie it onto a chair or you tie it onto your foot. So it's a loomless style of weaving. Remember, they were big in the 70s, part of the folk scene. So we're jumping to really when the wool industry really took off in Ireland. And prior to this, we have a lot of weaving at home. But here it begins to take on a completely different complexion with the arrival of the Normans. Now, the Normans, as you will know, built our walled cities and introduced different things, for example, guilds, more organised methods of working and so on. And they brought the fulling mill, the horizontal treadle loom, and the spinning wheel. Prior to that, we were using a distaff. Like the vertical water wheel was in existence from the 8th century or even the 7th century perhaps. So that wasn't brought by the Normans. But the Normans did bring different methodologies. So this is what you call a fulling mill, which we know as well as a tuck mill. And Ireland would have been covered in tuck mills. So you might have woven and dyed at home and brought your fabric to the tuck mill because it was very strenuous to finish the cloth. In Scotland, they call it kicking, and they would actually kick the wet fabric around it's a system of pre-shrinking. So here you would have the paddles that would pummel the fabric and move it along. The Normans introduced different technologies, but it was the Cistercians who actually really took our wool trade to a great height. In medieval Europe, wool was wealth. It was the most lucrative trade in medieval Europe, and the Cistercians were in charge of it in Ireland. The Cistercians formed an interesting partnership with the merchant bankers of Italy, and the merchant bankers of Italy would loan the monasteries cash in return for promises of wool and in return for wool. And at that time, it was such a lucrative and important arrangement that Italians manned our customs. This was around the 13th century. You're looking now, I'm talking about Jerpoint and Dusk. And so you've got names like Woolgrange and so on. And so this became very significant in the 13th century. And exporting big amounts of wool, I mean really huge amounts, and having tens of thousands of sheep. I mean, it was hard for us to imagine the scale of it. It was huge. Cattle were important, but the wool trade was more lucrative. And we had very good trade all over Europe because we've got good, safe natural harbours, made it very easy for us to trade. The Cistercians had kind of deals where they didn't have to pay the full kind of tariffs and so on. And by 1357, Uberti, the Italian writer, asserted that Irish textiles had reached a level of perfection that they were the most highly prized of all. Most of all, we were exporting brats, the capes I told you about, and they were particularly popular with armies. And cities like Drogheda, for example, were huge for producing the brats. Speaking of which, here we've got Rory Og, a rebel. So what happened was, as the Tudors expanded their control over Ireland, part of it was insisting on compliance with English style of dress, English custom, English language, and believe it or not, there were a whole series of laws prohibiting the wearing of Irish dress. The earliest one that I could find was in the 1400s. But by 1537, the wearing of the brat was banned completely, and it was associated mostly with rebels. And here you see Rory Og. There's £1,000 on his head. Ultimately, he's killed by members of the Fitzpatrick family, and his head was brought to Dublin Castle, ringed with the heads of rebels in 1578. And this is the pushback against the Tudor, the expansion of Tudor rule in Ireland. And here he is in the woods with the wolves in his brat. I love this particular picture. I think it's such an interesting piece of history. It's called the Rainbow Portrait with Queen Elizabeth. And if you look at the timing, this portrait was painted around the same time as the Battle of Kinsale, shortly thereafter or around that period. And she's essentially asserting her control over Ireland. She's described in the description as wearing mantle Irlandais. So she's wearing the Irish mantle or brat, a sort of romanticized, glamorized version, as a symbol of her conquest of the Irish. And if you look at the close-up of the brat, mantle or cape, you can see that it's got eyes and ears. I see everything, I hear everything, as she must have done in order to survive as she did. It's 7 years before this portrait was painted, she met Grace O'Malley, who was wearing at that point the Irish traditional long red cape, long red brat, and tied up with a big brooch. And she's described as wearing her hair loose and pinned up. So she was still resolutely in the Irish style. More laws against Irish dress came in, and they were followed up with fines and so on. You know, it's interesting for us to consider that, isn't it? Nevertheless, people persisted with it because we just had this passion for long, voluminous capes. At that time in Europe, the style for capes was, think of, Robin Hood. They were all wearing them really short. We were still wearing quite long cloaks at that time. Okay, so this was another find in the bog. It was the body of a soldier said to be returning from the Battle of Kinsale, which essentially ended the Gaelic aristocracy in 1602. And he's wearing Irish-style dress, he's wearing trews, and they understand that these would originally have been yellow and bright red. So this is our most extant garment, found on the body of a young woman buried in the bog with a baby, or found in the bog with a baby, I should say. And this dress shows very sophisticated dressmaking techniques, lots of, very heavy pleated skirts which needed a lot of support in the body. And it indicates an influence of Flanders, for example. That you can see in the museum in Dublin. It would originally have been red, dyed with madder. Okay, so what happened? We had a better standard of living at certain periods than our European counterparts because of our very successful wool trade. But there was a constant tussle with England, and the English wool traders were threatened by our success and pressurised English government to pass restrictions on the Irish wool trade in order to suit them more favourably. Now, English wool was always more popular than Irish wool, which was coarser and less expensive, therefore, because of our climate, more damp, the kind of sheep that thrived here. But nevertheless, it was still very important and very significant. It was crushed by legislation, and I just want to read for you in 1673. By 1673, no Irish wool product could be exported. And so we had the Earl of Stafford, who moved to Dublin Castle in 1633, and this is from him. I'm of the opinion that all wisdom advises to keep this kingdom as much subordinate and dependent upon England as is possible, and holding them from the manufacture of wool, which, unless otherwise directed, I shall by all means discourage, and then enforcing them to fetch their clothing from thence, England, how can they depart from us without nakedness and beggary? So once it was decided to crush the wool trade, which Jonathan Swift described as this fatal act, the idea came to introduce linen as a substitute, but also because wages were lower in Ireland. The linen production is much more difficult, much more time-consuming, and far more challenging, and actually ultimately less well-suited to Ireland than the wool trade was. But anyway, they discovered chlorine around the 1800s, and at that point linen production moved away from the farmers and it moved to big. This is the closest we have to an industrial revolution, not at this point here. This image that we're looking at here is from the 18th century. But ultimately, it's the closest we come to an industrial revolution in Ireland is the linen industry. And it moved out of the hands of small farmers into big factory-type situations. And it must have been terrible once they had chlorine, can you imagine? And they had whole families working in these situations. So there they are with the linen. Linen involves a whole process of rotting and breaking down the fibres. It's far more complex. Prior to the advent of chlorine, it took months to bleach it, and then chlorine came along and shortened the process. But so here we have our linen becoming world famous. This is our very luxury product. It was aimed at the luxury market. We'd always produced linen, but a lot of it was coarser, sackcloth. Think of sailing boats, think of sails. Now we're moving to the upper end, and we end up producing this very fine, very beautiful, almost translucent linen because of the quality of our waters. And ultimately this becomes a very significant industry, but as I say, in the hands of very few, not one that benefited the whole country very much. And when new technologies came in, people fell from it very quickly. It mostly employed women. And when the spinning jenny came in and so on, spinners could no longer earn. So we're heading towards the famine, and those are some of the reasons around that. I'm going to look at the 18th century here, the late 18th century. We're looking at the beautiful Ireland being at that point, Dublin being the second city of the empire. So we're looking at beautiful the nouveau riche wanting to have beautiful artisan products, and we've got wonderful textiles and so on being produced in the Liberties. This is Newbridge House in Donabate, and you can think of the upholstery, think of the curtains, think of the kind of clothes people were wearing in the 18th century, from the damasks to the all of this luxury clothing. Much of it was being made in Dublin in the Liberties by very poor families. And there was this incredible sort of divide between the wealthy and the poor. But we were producing very high-end quality products at that time. Does anybody know what that textile there on the right is? Poplin. Poplin is actually, you could consider poplin to be our truly only absolutely unique textile, because it was innovated in Ireland to get around the restrictions on the wool trade. And it was produced in Dublin. The Huguenots, as you know, were around Cork and Waterford, and they weren't restricted to Dublin. Dublin, the Liberties, was the home of poplin. Poplin is created with a wool warp and a silk weft, so that you can see the silk but not the wool. It's known for its rustle and glow. And this was in the late 17th and early 18th century. Tens of thousands of Huguenot weavers settled in Dublin, Youghal, Cork, Waterford and Kilkenny. As some of you may know, Philip Cushion in Cushendale Woolen Mills is of Huguenot descent. And they were mostly weavers who were encouraged over here by an Act of Parliament. And the Liberties became the centre of poplin weaving. Now here we've got our second major textile, became the darling of the courts of Europe. Ball gowns, cummerbunds, waistcoats, curtains, you name it. Elliots, they were weaving poplin and producing even silk poplin ties right up until the 1960s. The silk came from China. It was dyed very bright colours. It was considered the finest silk. This is really a luxury product. And you would have seen it on the ball gowns of royalty and so on. So I suppose I'm trying to impress on you the contrast of, people that were actually living in quite poor conditions, creating this very exquisite, very high-end stuff, which is actually typifies the textile trade around the world, because it was Jewish immigrants that produced lace, for example, in Venice. And, it was the Muslim settlers who innovated knitting in Spain. So it's not unusual that that particular dynamic would have existed. To give you an idea of the scale of it, that's the tenters. Prior to that, they would have stretched the cloth out on tenterhooks. This is the tenter house, which was like a giant airing cupboard. It had huge furnaces, boilers, and then a big open space, and you'd hang all the cloth up and allow it to dry. So look at the size of that now. And that was built in 1814, and remnants of that building can still be seen in Dublin. We're going to jump ahead after the famine, which, as most people will recognise, was a sort of a, in many ways, cut the country. You know, it cut our culture, it cut the timeline, cut the people, broken-hearted, and destroyed, decimated the culture. But what happened after the famine was that the people that had stayed had no industry, were still suffering from disease and malnutrition, or traumatised, living in wretched conditions. What did they have? Well, they had time and they had wool, and sometimes they had linen. So it was, without industry, textiles rose to the fore as a means of alleviating poverty. And it was quite deliberately designed to target the niche market so that Irish people were to produce top-end products for the luxury market. And this is how it happened. So at that point you have mills in more or less every village. You've got people wearing homespun clothing. You've got the ongoing tradition of hand weaving. You've also got the fact that in order to encourage linen in the 17th century, they gave out thousands and thousands of looms to encourage linen weaving. And some of these still continue to be used and repurposed all those years later. And so we still have a tradition of weaving, but we've got very poor communities here. This is the traditional clothing. So you can see that the clothes dyed with madder. This is actually from 1913, but it's just to give you an indication of the way that people were still dressing at that time in the bare feet. That's the earliest colour photograph taken in Ireland, taken by two French anthropologists. We're going to go to lace. Lace is an interesting story on many levels. It preceded the Irish tweed and weaving industry, and it started it existed before the famine, but it was around the time of the famine that it really came into its own. It became what you could call a fair trade enterprise, set up by women, run by women, women from across the religious divide, nuns and wives of local clergymen and so on got together. Here, for example, you see Joanna Carter, a Quaker and an educationalist, began Mount Mellick embroidery. I've got an example of it there on there. So that was 1825, but the bulk of them came later. Lace itself, we know from findings in Rathfarnham Castle that people were weaving lace here as early as the 1700s, but no one was doing it. It was an upper class craft. It wasn't something that was used in any mainstream way until around the time of the famine. Limerick lace. Limerick lace is a bit of an outlier in that it was set up by an English businessman. It was very much run as a business. And just to give you an indication of it, the girls were apprenticed from the age of 8. And they worked until they were 15, and then they were given on contract to employers. So it was quite a difficult situation. And some of his teenagers who were apprenticed didn't want to come into work because they said that he had disobeyed the details of their contract. And he said, many of the girls worked by candlelight, but if they did, it was of their own request. And I never kept them to work longer than 12 hours per day. The girls had complained that he made them pay for the candles themselves. The teenagers were sentenced to 2 weeks in prison for not returning to work. But as I say, Limerick lace was the exception to the rule. The rest of them were philanthropic, and many of them were run as cooperatives. So we're going to look just briefly at that. Clones lace. It imitated needle lace, but it was done with crochet hooks. And it became... it was such a popular luxury product that it became the source of many, many women paying for their passage to America, and we have chain migration. The clones crochet hooks were known as famine hooks, and they were producing these beautiful things. Now, machine-made lace was already in existence, so this is an artisan product at the top end. You're paying extra because everyone knows it's time-consuming. The lace schools themselves were set up all around the country, And if you got good at design, you could earn more. So there's an element of agency to it. Because it was small and light and transportable, you could bring it yourself and sell it wherever you wanted to. So it gave women great freedom. Many of those women who were lace makers went to America, got work as domestic servants, and sent the money over for their families. Lace brought over so many people to it's a story that isn't very well known, because a lot of the time when they went to America, that's the last time they're ever going to look at a lace thing, right? You know, having been doing it for years and years. But in some cases, the lace making continued through families in America, and they come back here because the Irish laces are quite unique, because we developed our own motifs. We based them on Italian laces and so on, but we did our own thing. So here we've got like that's a shamrock, and we've got Irish rose and so on. So we had our own style. Your lace is a very interesting example. At one point there were 500 women, and the nuns gave it to the women. It was run as a cooperative. They had childcare facilities. They built school and everything. And in, I think it's less than a decade, it went from not existing at all to being on the veil of Princess Alexandra of Denmark. That's to give you an indication of the level of expertise that was developed in a very short period of time. It's considered a true lace because it's made with needles rather than Limerick lace, which is done on machine-made net with embroidery done on it. So by the time Queen Elizabeth died, her lace was worth 6.3 million sterling, and that's Irish lace. So it was huge for the Irish economy. And this is the wedding of Princess Royal, the Princess Royal in 1858, and she's wearing poplin and Irish lace. And so I included this little bit of interest here because we're actually, the heyday of Irish lace really is starting to draw to a close round about 1910, but specifically with the First World War, because the styles became more masculine and the whole Edwardian Belle Epoque thing seemed very frivolous and OTT, and it just stylistically it just didn't fit any longer, but it continued to be produced for veils and for priests' vestments and so on. But here we have an interesting little aside. Unionist women commissioned a train for Queen Mary here. And it took 60 lace makers working in shifts day and night for 6 months to create the train that she was to wear in India. And they put Irish symbols into them. And when I went to Youghal, I met this woman, and she said that when they sent over the veil, they had one of the lace makers had put in a thing around the size of an old pound coin, and it said Dainty in Aran. And the veil was returned with the thing cut out, and that they must replace it with a flower. And she kept the Dainty in Aran thing, and it's, the Dainty in Aran motif, the small extract from the veil, and it's still in Youghal. Okay, so lace has already kind of proven its way. So what follows next is tweed. And we have the hand weaving culture already existing in Donegal, homespun clothing, quite a high level of homespun weaving. And this image here is from Gweedore in 1890. And we have tremendous poverty, and the weaving here is going to be taken over by the likes of Alice Hart and Lady Aberdeen, who are going to shape it for the international market, and they're going to bring it to a very high level. Okay, so this is a whole family involved in weaving here. So you can see the spinning wheel, that's the Galway wheel there. And at this point, the looms were quite large. We've got the flying shuttle. And so weaving is very much a male profession now, and it's the women who do all the hard work of carding and scouring and all the rest of it and get no credit. So you can see they had carding parties where they would card together and sing to pass the time. And I love this picture here because you can see the bare feet and her best frock. And they would have often sat outside like this because the cottages were quite dark. And I'm not certain about this loom here, but it's possible that this would have been a linen loom. The way you'd know it is that it would have a long distaff for the strands of the flax. I've got some flax on the table there if you want to have a look as well. So this is a tweed mart where they would have brought along their tweed to sell, and the buyers from the top fashion houses would have turned up to peruse the wares. And it was a way that there was quite a lot of agency involved in tweed. It was double-sided because, of course, really the rule of thumb for many of the years that followed was that it was either weave or emigrate. So I'm not suggesting that, you know, many of the people who were weavers loved their work. It was just that was what there was to do. They had time, they had wool, you know, and they had designers going around making them produce for the top end, because machine-made textiles were the norm. England had already had the Industrial Revolution. The arts and crafts movement was into hand-dyed, artisan-made textiles. So no one is hand-weaving because they need to in this period. So we've got the Congested District Board. We've got a country in turmoil, and we've got Lord Balfour setting up the Congested District Board. And the thinking behind the Congested District Board is to kill home rule with kindness. So the Congested District Board supported the funding of much of this equipment. Now, this is in Foxford Woolen Mills, and this would have been still with water. We had, as you're probably aware, we didn't have coal, which is one of the reasons why we didn't have very much industry apart from deliberation, because we were primarily producing food for England. But we had water for a long time. Then we had diesel, and ultimately we didn't have electricity in Ireland. Some people I know will remember the rollout of electricity was very late, wasn't it? Even as late in some places as the 60s. Someone even said to me the 70s. So these kind of big things would have been water powered. And they were producing quite sophisticated fabrics for the top end of the market already. This advertisement here from 1897 shows you some of the complexity around our trade. It says here, "This delightful change of fashion will be of infinitely more practical benefit to Irish peasants than home rule." And this is on Bond Street. This is top of the range, lined with fur and silk. And I'm sure that the colours were fabulous. So this is very much a luxury product. We've got Lady Aberdeen here, and I'm just going to fly through the next little bit just to move us on. But you'll see that she's wearing something here, and this is called Celtic embroidery. You know, the Book of Kells wasn't actually seen until 1849. So, yes, 1849, the Book of Kells went on display. And we were at that point looking for the Irish identity. And so Celtic embroidery became a way of expressing Irishness. And it was developed by a woman called Alice Hart, a philanthropic woman called Alice Hart in Donegal. Lady Aberdeen was married to the Viceroy, which is the representative of the Queen at the time. And she was pro-home rule and a suffragette, so she was quite the controversial character. Here she is in Celtic embroidery, which was taken up by the Gaelic League, and it became very much a part of Irish cloth, and Celtic embroidery became very much a part of our searching for Irish identity during that period. And you'll see it here, for example, 1910, the Doneema Guild, set up by Yeats's sisters, Lolly and Lily. And this here, you'll see those designs here. They were not around until the late 1800s. I mean, of course they existed in, you know, we had them on the Ardagh Chalice and so on, but we didn't see them. There was a long gap, you know. Where do we see them now? Well, you'll see them, yeah. Can anyone think of anywhere else where you would see Celtic embroidery now? Apart from in jewellery, it's popular in jewellery now, but... Table linen and in churches. And also on the priests' garments, and that's where you'd see it most now. We haven't heard much about carpets because carpets are a real latecomer. The Donegal Carpet Company was only established in 1898, and it carried on all the way through till 1987. you can see by the picture it was mostly women. Women were always very big in textiles. It was considered clean work, safe work for women, you know. And look what they were producing in the 1900s. So if we imagine it wasn't sophisticated, we are wrong. Beautiful Art Nouveau influences going on there. To touch on the Kinsale Cape. Anybody ever seen one in real life? No. I went to Cork and I think it was in, I can't remember the name of the bee. Bandon. And most of the Kinsale Capes were lined with red satin, but in Bandon they favoured green, and they had images of women still wearing them, and the Kinsale Cape was made right up until the 1960s. These were heirloom pieces. They were very expensive. They were normally handed down through mother and daughter. It's a fabulous photo, isn't it? That's 1890s in Waterford. By 1915, 75,000 people were employed in the linen industry, and as I said to you, that was the closest we got to an industrial revolution, but it was all in the north, where there was coal and where industry just took a different trajectory. And linen made that trajectory even more stark, the contrast to the south. When we had the Rising, what appeared on our medals was Irish silk poplin. So we've got that linkage of our traditional native textiles and patriotism. And you'll still see poplin. Poplin isn't woven anymore. The skills have actually been lost. It was handed down through the family in Huguenots, and as far as I'm aware, we don't have a single person in Ireland now who can hand weave Irish silk poplin. But we do still have some silk poplin to show, and it's on the curtains in Áras an Uachtaráin, and I have a wedding dress that I was lent from, which was made in the 1970s from silk poplin as well, made by Elliott's, who continued to produce it for a long time. Douglas Hyde, when he took office, insisted on we will not be a nation of imitators. We will reclaim Irish language, Irish culture. What does it mean to be Irish? Well, in his case, it meant taking office wearing the flat cap, the uniform of the working class man, and hand-spun Donegal tweed. And this set a precedent so that now, to this day, our presidents will bring visiting dignitaries to Magee to be fitted out with Donegal tweed, which is still considered our national textile now. A little mention of how war and textiles went hand in hand. Tate's in Limerick, the first assembly line factory in the world. Yeah, and huge. And it made uniforms for all of the wars, for both British and Irish troops. Yeah, from 1853 up until the 1970s. Yes. What happened when we finally got independence was that we wanted to take over where the Congested District Board had left off, so we set up Gaeltacht Aran. Gaeltacht Aran essentially did more or less the same thing. It focused on the Gaeltachts, which are the Irish-speaking areas in Ireland, which were historically underdeveloped. Really, they were still suffering from the legacy of the famine because of the poor land, the subdivision of land, and all of the unfair land policies that led to the famine. So we have very poor communities, and they were the focus of Gaeltacht Aran. And we have the focusing of hand weaving. So there's samples there for the hand weavers, yes. And you can see the products that go together: tweeds, knitwear, and hand embroidered linen. What's gone? Lace. Are we ever going to get onto the Aran sweater, considering I wrote a whole book about it? I'll just do it. I'll touch on it just briefly. Okay, so those fellas there, that's not Aran, right? That is Borneen tweed. So essentially it's a loose woven white fabric. What they're wearing is the traditional fisherman's ganzi, which was dyed dark colours. It was normally only ornamented from below the chest up because they wore their trousers high. It was dense. It was a functional working garment. So why would it be in white, for goodness sake? So it wasn't in white, but what was the communion sweaters for the young fellas for their communion. And when Muriel Gahan went to the Aran Islands, her father had been in the Congested District Board. She went to the Aran Islands in the 1930s specifically to look for craft that she could sell in Dublin. She spotted the boys in their lovely Borny and Ganseys, and she said, now there's a winner, knit them in adult sizes and I can sell them. And sure enough, she did. And as soon as she did, the women got the idea, and away they went in the curras to the mainland to sell their Aran sweaters in the Galway markets, and the rest, as they say, is history. So look, here we have already in 1950, we've got Grace Kelly in an Aran sweater. Is it an Aran sweater, or is that actually Scottish knit? By now it doesn't matter. If it's got cables, we own it. And who's there? Is Marilyn Monroe, and she's in Kennedy's sweater maybe, because Kennedy made the Aran sweater huge when he came over, and he was gifted them by Tom, do you remember? Portico Síocháin, sorry. Portico Síocháin. When the Clancy brothers appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show in 1961, they wore the Aran sweaters a little accidentally. The mother had... Anyway, Portico Síocháin gave Kennedy an Aran sweater, and then it became very much a desirable object. And at the same time, Portico Síocháin was smart enough to open up the Japanese market. And then we had a huge boom. And of course, there were too many Aran sweaters wanted and too few Aran knitters to knit them. So where were they knit? They were knit in the tenements of Limerick and the tenements of Dublin, and then someone took them away and put in handmade in the Aran Island on the label. Because if you were to put all the Aran sweaters together, they'd go from here to the moon and back. And so there were huge teams of knitters, and in Donegal, massive teams of knitters. Blarney Woolen Mills, huge teams of knitters in Cork. I presume around Kilkenny there must have been a lot of women knitting for the Aran industry as well. Yeah. Anyway, these fellas, they wore it accidentally. Apparently the mother sent it, and they were going to wear their suits. And when they took off the coat and the manager saw the sweaters, he said, that's it. I often wondered if they regretted it, because think how warm those sweaters would have been. And this is in the old wool, right? We're not talking merino here. But anyway, 700%. And we know that because by then we were already monitoring our trade with America because it was huge. And so we know that 700%. Now the Aran is suddenly part of who we are, and this doesn't go away. If you remember the advertisements for the gathering in 2013, everyone's in an Aran sweater. It's like our national dress. So you can see it entering into. So there's a guy working in a lovely white sweater on a boat. As you do. Sybil Connolly, very significant because she kept all the workers in Ireland, because she brought Irish textiles to a very high level, because she was the beginning of the haute couture movement in Ireland, and because she supported traditional crafts. Here she is at a weaving factory in Glen Columkill with Father MacDyer and the weavers of Glen. Look at them, all the old, because Father MacDyer said if the immigration was destroying those communities, they were hemorrhaging people. If they don't weave, they've got nothing. And so Sybil Connolly and the love of Tweed in the 50s and 60s was a boon to Ireland. There'd never been a better time to be a weaver. And many of the companies that you'll see now, such as McNuts and so on, they sprang up at that time, sprang up and expanded and so on. Look at the size of Blarney Woolen Mills, and remember how many, some of the people my age and older will remember how many wool spinners we had. I'm sure some of you remember Tivoli and all of this. Blarney at that time was spinning, weaving and everything, right up until the 1980s. Now it's just a retail store. Does anybody here, can any of you name an Irish wool spinner in this country? Donegal yarns. That's our biggest. They produce all the yarns for knitting and for tweed. But we've also got Cushendale in Graignamanagh, spinning and dyeing beautiful, beautiful yarns for fabric and also for knitting. We've got Kerry Woolen Mills, and we've got Studio Donegal. So we've now got 4. But if I had a room full of knitters of a certain age, they would have remembered 4 times that in
Dripsy
the Blino.
was another one. Dripsy Woolen Mills.
Dripsy, well gone now.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right. Dripsy. Yeah, that's right. Dripsy was huge, and they had a village and everything in Dripsy, yeah. Wool in the 60s. What was happening then was that we were already a little under siege with artificial textiles, but we had a very thriving industry, and what we haven't touched on is furniture. Furniture by, let me see, I think it's O'Dee's furniture, Yawl carpets, and so on, you know. So we have still got a lot of people in making. So this is an ad by the Wool Secretariat to promote Irish wool and textiles. Glen Abbey furniture, sorry. Yawl carpets, OD clothing. Anyone remember? You'd remember the name, kind of. Yeah. Yeah, so it kind of shows we were still cool. We were cool then. A little bit cool. This is an interesting aside. I suppose we've been talking about the value of textiles, but we haven't been talking about its effect on communities and the fact that people spent decades working in it. So this is Marion Mulcahy, 3 decades making yawl carpets. There she is as a younger woman, and there she is before the closing of yawl carpets in 1984. She's working on a design for a carpet for MGM Film Studios there. Okay, we're just going to look at what's left. So manufacturing has collapsed. Irish textiles continue into the niche market, and we're coming up to the present. We did it. We covered centuries, and we landed in 2023. So here we are. Aran, so I should have actually not shown the picture and then asked the question. So our most lucrative textile export is knitwear. You wouldn't think it, would you? Yeah. I mean, we make carpet, upholstery, we do this, we do that, but it's knitwear that's the big winner. So we've got quite a lot of knitwear companies, and our knitwear designers are very highly valued. So it's not only, for example, the machine knit. Here's a company set up in 1856, still going strong. And we've also got young designers using it hand knit, bespoke. We've got weavers such as 5th generation weaver there in Ardara, Kieran Malloy of Malloy and Sons, who you would know from menswear, of the Italian and German market particularly. And that's a collaboration that they did with a local weaver. So they make beautiful blankets and so on as well. Our dedicated hand weaving studio is Studio Donegal, and they make bespoke clothing. It's expensive, it's beautiful. They use a lot of Irish wool. They spin wool as well. Our Irish wool is best suited to carpets. It's very rough. It's often better for insulation in carpets than it is for wearing. In fact, I have a scarf here I was going to throw around. Just hand that along and just say, oh, that's Irish wool, old Irish wool. No one really uses that anymore. Now when we use Irish wool, we mix it with lighter wools like merino, because we don't need very warm clothing because we've got central heating, and so we want it lighter and lighter and softer all the time. Eventually it'll just get so soft and so light. But it works very well for carpets. So here we have Dixon's carpets in Uachtarad and Cardigan rugs in Wexford. So this is very much in the luxury market again. Beautiful designer carpets, and they're all woven with yarns spun in Donegal yarns. This is where you'll see lace. Lace has been relegated just to hobbies because it's so time consuming. Think about it. I mean, this little bit of lace here this is a linen wedding dress, and this little bit of lace here took months to make. So you just can't pay for lace. It's just the only kind of lace that really exists is crochet lace, because it can be a bit quicker to do. But the traditional laces, as you would know, Carrick-Macross lady, it's time. Yeah, time. So it just exists on the top end, but that doesn't mean that it's not of value and that you won't see it. You will, and you'll also see it in artistic projects. Now I'm on to one of my favourite people in the wool world. It's Philip Cushion. And if I'm going to throw out there a question. Does anybody know what a vertical mill is? What's a vertical mill? It's a complete mill. It means that a giant bag of wool arrives, and when it leaves, it's a bolt of fabric. Everything that happens in between happens in Cushendale Woolen Mills. It's dyed, it's carded, it's spun, it's woven, it's finished. So it's a very complex, arduous production, and we now only have 2 such mills. artisan textile production, you could describe it as. I have some samples over there on the table for you to have a little feel at. Philip Cushion has a piece of equipment here from the 19th century. That's a spinning mule. And I love that because it really shows you the connection between what we were talking about when weaving was reinvigorated after the famine, all the way through to 2023. And as he says, if it still works, why would you throw it out? And there's some of his mohair wool there. Have any of you been to Graig Manor? Yeah, so you're familiar. Yeah. And so that is the end of our little whiz tour.